Hello, fellow communicators, and welcome back to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a podcast brought to you by myself, along with the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. Together, we are working to make the communication theory, known as Coordinated Management of Meaning, or CMM for short, more accessible to the people who can benefit from it, which is you and all of us. Because we all communicate, we can all benefit from having the language and the tools to do it more effectively. One way I describe CMM is that the theory itself centers on creating better social worlds for ourselves by engaging more intentionally with others. Sounds pretty great, right? Well, it is. At least I think so. And as I've said, my goal above all else is to make this theory accessible and easy to understand and apply, so that we can actually put it to use in our everyday lives. And I'm not the first person to see the need for this. CMM has been criticized for being too difficult to understand, for having too much complexity or nuance, but really that is representative of an equally complex social world and equally nuanced communication patterns. CMM has to be complex and full of layers in order to even begin to encompass the layered world it seeks to understand. So I'm not saying that it shouldn't be so complex, but that starting with all this complexity, it's also important to translate the language and tools of CMM to be more accessible. Because what good does the theory do if we don't know how to use it to actually start creating those better social worlds? The way that the CMM Institute does this is by explaining CMM through three facets. These three facets are a perspective, a set of practices, and the goal of a better social life. I want to dive into this today because I think it could be helpful for us to have different ways to understand the theory itself. This is going to be a little bit of that meta-communication that I talked about before, since we're now looking at a way to understand how we understand the theory. But if we can keep slowly adding these layers one at a time, then we will have a simple way to tackle these not-so-simple concepts. So, the first facet of CMM, a perspective, meaning that what CMM offers us is a perspective. This perspective that CMM offers us is about how we orient ourselves towards communication, stories, and our social worlds, how we are approaching these things. For me, the way that the perspective of CMM shows up in my life is that it acts like a lens. Like I'm wearing a pair of CMM tinted glasses. Or like going back to the perspective metaphor that my grandpa talked about in one of the previous conversation episodes, if my social world is a building, then CMM is the path I walk to get to that building. There are a lot of different paths that lead up to this building. These paths might be informed by our beliefs and values and things like what we know or don't know. You and I might both be approaching the same building, but we might also take two different paths to get there. One way that I think of this is by relating it to something I see happening in the largest social world. There are a lot of social injustices that happen all over the world that require huge change to overcome. Generally, these are deeply systemic issues. Issues that I will probably never see the end of in my lifetime. But that's not to say I think we're doing nothing right now. Yes, in order to fix a lot of these issues, it will take legislative action and real change, but something that I see happening right now that I think sets the stage for that real change is conversation. Conversations that are new. Right now, I see more conversations happening about things like climate change or systemic racism. Conversations that were not happening to this extent 20 or even 10 years ago. The second facet of CMM that we will talk about in a second is CMM as a set of practices. So in the same way CMM gives us a perspective and then builds actual practices on top of that, what I see happening in my society is that before we can enact real change, we're in a stage of developing a new perspective by engaging in conversations, by creating awareness and naming things that haven't been talked about. If you don't have the language to describe something you are experiencing, then there is no way to talk about it, let alone fix it. A lot of times we want to jump right into the action, and that's not a bad desire. But in order to give ourselves the best chance at using those tools and the best chance that that action is actually effective, we have to first spend time in the perspective part. So back to CMM, the way that the perspective of CMM differs from other comm theories is that it emphasizes looking at communication rather than through it, focusing on what is happening in the moment of communication rather than what happens as a result of communication. Does that make sense? Again, it's like in the conversation episode. My grandpa spoke about how he was really focused on the destination for a long time, that he missed the beauty of the journey. You know, that's a saying you might have heard, that it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. This perspective is kind of like that. If other comm theories are focused on the destination of where does communication get us, then CMM is about the journey of communicating itself. So facet number 2, CMM as a set of practices. Now that we have our CMM glasses on and understand the perspective CMM takes, we can actually use the tools it has to offer. Even the name of CMM, Coordinated Management of Meaning, refers to the actions that we do in communication. We coordinate with others to manage the meaning we make. But that process isn't always easy. So we need the tools of CMM to do those actions of coordinating, managing, and making meaning better. The practices that CMM gives us include the models that we have already talked about in previous episodes, the daisy model, loose, serpentine, hierarchy. A big part of the practice of CMM is beginning to view our interactions as part of a larger system, where we are serpentining through conversation, taking turns, and adding to the shared pool of meaning. Here, context is key. It shapes everything, and when we can see it for what it is in our interactions, it's like placing the last piece of the puzzle and finally being able to see the entirety of the picture. It's what allows us to see our own speech acts, which is what we call it in CMM. Speech act is just what you say in an interaction. Each thing you say would be one speech act. Zooming out and looking at the context is what allows us to see our speech acts as turns in the conversation, responding to the previous turn set by our conversation partner, and setting the conversation on a new path depending on how we respond. Another piece of the practice of CMM that I find compelling is the idea that we are curious participants, that we actively shape our social worlds, because whether we think that we are passive and powerless or participating and powerful, that affects how we show up to our social worlds. We have to get into the practice of recognizing the ways that we are participating and contributing. Another practice of CMM is looking for patterns, seeing the turns in the conversation and the impact of multiple contexts to see what pattern is being formed. And since we are participants and not passive observers, we then get to decide what pattern we want to create and actually take the action to create it. The practices of CMM revolve around empowering us in our communication. Finally, the third facet is the goal of better social life. Once we understand ourselves as participants with the ability to choose our actions, we then use those actions with the goal of creating better social worlds for ourselves and those around us. For Barnett Pierce, this was a deeply moral issue. The question of what should I do was one that he claimed was always present in our interaction, whether we knew it or not. In our choices that we made at each turn, we might be making our decisions as a way to answer a different version of the same question, which is, what should I do in order to make things better? In CMM, this translates to how we engage in our lived stories to make things better. But also, how do we tell stories that make things better too? A perspective, a set of practices, and a goal of better social worlds. CMM takes a holistic approach to communication, providing us with language, action tools, and a goal. To me, I think this can answer the question of what does CMM do for me? These are the forms that it takes in our actual communication, not just in theory, but in practice too. So let's really consider that. What does CMM do for us? How does CMM as a perspective show up in our lives? Where are the practices of CMM coming to play? How does the goal of better social worlds affect our choices? Well, that's all for today. As always, I'm Abbie, and thank you once again for joining me for Stories Lived, Stories Told. And thank you, all my fellow communicators, for asking questions, for being curious, showing up, and desiring to create better social worlds. Bye for now.